Part 1. Charles the Hapless and the Bedtime Royal Parade. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. I want you to dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of lukewarm tea, and settle into a chair that feels just a little too soft. Not too soft, you don't want to topple over, but soft enough that you're starting to drift. We're going to wander through the quiet, oddly depressing lives of Europe's royals. You know, the kind of history that doesn't make for great TikToks or dramatic reenactments, but is perfect for gently nudging your brain toward sleep. Let's start with Charles II of Spain, or, as some historians quietly whisper while polishing their glasses, the unfortunate genetic experiment. He was called Charles the Bewitched because, well, something about him seemed cursed. Mostly, though, he was just painfully unlucky with the genes he inherited. His family line had been practicing what some might call over-enthusiastic cousin appreciation for generations, and it showed. Charles was born in 1661, and from day one, everyone noticed he was not exactly robust. Imagine being a baby who is immediately diagnosed as having a host of congenital issues, literally before you even get to crawl or fuss over toys. His jaw was so underdeveloped that even chewing was difficult, and the boy had trouble speaking clearly. He was small, frail, and apparently his doctor spent a lot of time just watching him drool. Charming. The Spanish Habsburgs, in their infinite wisdom, or perhaps infinite denial, kept marrying cousins to cousins, thinking maybe, just maybe, the family could keep its royal mojo intact. Instead, they made Charles. Charles's life was a slow procession of illnesses, awkward meals, and the occasional fainting spell. And it's not like he was allowed to wander the countryside to heal naturally. No, he was a king from infancy, which meant he had to endure all the pomp, ceremony, and stress that came with ruling a feigning empire. People often remark on his sad little eyes, which, given the context, makes perfect sense. This was a kid who couldn't even chew meat properly, yet was expected to make decisions about the economy and wars. Now you might wonder, did anyone at the time notice this was maybe not ideal for a ruler? Some did. A few whispered. But most were too busy planning the next cousin marriage to care. Which brings me to a gentle note about dynastic inbreeding. The Habsburg jaw, also called the mandibular prognathism, was essentially a family hallmark, kind of like a crest or coat of arms, but, dental. Charles's elongated jaw, combined with his fragile health, made him a living warning about what happens when you double down on the keep it in the family strategy. But hey, tradition. He survived into adulthood, which, given the circumstances, was impressive. As an adult, he spent his time doing what most people do when they're sickly and royal, being waited on hand and foot. Historical records note that he enjoyed gentle walks, quiet reflection, and staring out windows for long periods. He didn't seem particularly ambitious, but then again, ambition tends to require energy, and Charles had barely enough energy to eat soft bread. Let's float over to another royal disaster, Louis XIV's grandson, Philip V of Spain. Not to be confused with Charles, because, of course, history loves recycling names. Philip had his own quiet brand of melancholy and chronic illness. Philip was slightly more functional than Charles, but he also had what might be called a royal frown habit. He worried a lot, which is honestly relatable. He had many children, because royal duty, but also many nervous breakdowns over whether the grandchildren would continue the slightly awkward genetic line. Philip's court was a symphony of mild tensions. Picture endless dinners where everyone is politely smiling while calculating inheritances, forming alliances, and occasionally whispering about whose arm looked too short or whose nose was too pointy. To the average person, this might seem dull, even boring. But for us, lying back in the soft glow of our bedside lamp, it's perfect. Each little quirk, each minor complaint, each sigh of a sickly prince gently lulls the mind. Speaking of minor complaints, let's slide over to the Stuart dynasty for a moment. James II of England, he of the famously scandalous conversion to Catholicism, also fits nicely into this pattern. He had some political drama, but we're not here for that. No, we're here for the quiet personal failures. James liked to dress elaborately, and apparently took comfort in long, solitary walks in palace gardens. He had children, some of whom were healthy enough to cause trouble later, but he also had the kind of melancholy gaze that screams, "I wish I had just stayed home and read a book," which honestly is a very relatable royal energy. If you imagine walking through the halls of these palaces, it's not all sword fights and daring escapes. It's mostly soft carpets, echoing footsteps, and the occasional sniffle. There are long afternoons spent in drawing rooms where everyone sips tea and debates whether the crown jewel's new polish matches the drapery. And yes, in some cases, it does not. Now, we can't talk about mildly tragic royals without touching on the German principalities. There's a reason people joke that if you were a German prince in the 17th or 18th century, your life consisted mostly of 1. Inheriting a small territory, 2. Worrying about succession, 3. Marrying a distant cousin, and 4. Occasionally attending a ball where everyone is polite but no one smiles. Frederick II of Prussia, for example, was rather brilliant, but also had long stretches of melancholic isolation. He liked music, reading, and writing letters to friends far away, sometimes describing court life as tediously ornate, which again fits our sleepy theme nicely. And then there's Maria Theresa of Austria. Part 2. The curious case of inbred dynasties and quiet disasters. All right, welcome back, friends. If you're still cozy, maybe lying on a couch or sinking slowly into your bed, perfect. We're about to drift further into the slow, gently tragic world of Europe's royals, the kind of history that's mostly just people being mildly miserable and slightly ill. No action sequences, no battles, just quiet despair and odd habits, all wrapped in the soft glow of palace chandeliers. Let's begin with the infamous Habsburg jaw again. I promise we won't dwell on it too long, but it's worth remembering because it's basically the visual shorthand for centuries of genetic overachievement. Charles II had it, obviously, but he wasn't alone. Many Habsburgs inherited that same underdeveloped jawline, fragile limbs, and general inability to chew effectively. It was like a family club, except membership guaranteed a lifetime of awkward meals and awkward public appearances. Charles's relatives were not particularly better off. Take his cousin, Maria Ana of Spain, for example. She had a slightly more functional jaw, but shared that Habsburg penchant for fainting at inconvenient times. One historian delicately noted that she often collapsed in corridors without warning, which, if you picture it, is not terrifying, just sort of sleepy. You can almost imagine palace staff rolling their eyes and placing a fainting couch just in case. Speaking of fainting couches, let's drift toward another European family, the Bavarian Wittelsbachs. They were fond of long, quiet meals, lots of embroidery, and perfectly timed sighs. Charles Albert of Bavaria, who briefly became Holy Roman Emperor in the 18th century, was otherwise unremarkable, except for his tendency to brood. He brooded a lot. Over political alliances, over whether his children would be healthy, over whether the silverware matched the curtains. His family probably considered him the mildly depressing but polite relative you only see once a year. Perfectly suitable for our bedtime history. Then there's the quirky world of the Bourbon court in France. Louis XVI, the one who eventually met the guillotine, is often remembered for the end of monarchy drama, but his personal life was full of subtle misfortunes and awkwardness. As a child, he was shy, introverted, and inclined to mathematics. He hated confrontation and would avoid arguments by quietly walking away, which is admirable if you like calm conflict avoidance. Even as king, he spent long stretches quietly worrying about his wife, Marie Antoinette, and whether they were doing the right thing. His court was a tapestry of polite tensions, soft sighs, and faint whispers. Not dramatic, not exciting, but gently hypnotic. Marie Antoinette herself, contrary to popular legend, was more charming than scandalous in her early years. She liked pastries, fashion, and, gasp, quiet walks in the gardens. She had moments of genuine anxiety about political matters, but mostly focused on her children and the tiny, endless frustrations of palace life. Remember, being a queen didn't just mean a crown and grand balls. It also meant dealing with endless etiquette, misbehaving courtiers, and the occasional awkward dinner. She was, in her own way, another expert in quiet endurance. Let's slide over to England for a while. George III, yes, the one famous for losing America, wasn't just a monarch of colonies. He was a man of peculiar habits. He loved simple pleasures, gardening, cattle, and long walks in the countryside. As he aged, he developed periods of mental instability, which he weathered quietly with the support of devoted family and attendants. His obsession with order extended to his gardens and even the way furniture was arranged. Imagine lying in bed and picturing a king fussing over the spacing of rose bushes. Relaxing, right? Across the Channel, the Russian Romanovs had their own brand of quiet eccentricity. Peter the Great, despite his energetic reforms, also had a soft side that often went unnoticed. He was fond of collecting curiosities, tinkering with mechanical devices, and sometimes just staring out windows, perhaps pondering whether the empire would survive another winter without someone misplacing the silverware. Later Romanovs, like Alexander III, were calmer, introverted, and spent long hours in reflection, often staring at portraits of ancestors and quietly sighing about dynastic duties. It's not exciting, but it's the perfect kind of gentle, sleepy content. Now let's talk about one of my favorite sleepy monarchs, Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire. He had a condition later called the insane king, though it's probably fairer to say he had long bouts of melancholia and intermittent delusions. The most famous of these was the glass delusion, where he believed parts of his body were made of glass and might shatter at any moment. Imagine quietly tiptoeing around a palace, fearful that your elbow might crack. Not dramatic, not thrilling, just oddly specific and slightly pathetic. And because we like our bedtime tales calm, we can picture him gently tapping his glass body parts and hoping no one notices. Meanwhile, in Portugal, King João V ruled with a quieter temperament. He was extremely wealthy, devoted to art and architecture, and had little interest in confrontation. He collected religious relics and often spent long periods in reflection, thinking about morality, succession, and whether his palace ceilings were gilded just enough. It's a subtle form of luxury-induced melancholy, which pairs nicely with the soft tea and dim light of your evening. Shifting gently to Scandinavia, Christian VII of Denmark is another case in point. He suffered from what would now be called mental illness, lived largely under the care of advisors, and found solace in music and minor distractions. He wasn't particularly effective as a king, but he was quiet, contemplative, and prone to long periods of inactivity. For our purposes, he's basically the historical equivalent of lying in bed and watching clouds drift by. Gentle, slow-moving, and mildly melancholic. While we're in the north, let's briefly consider Sweden's Gustav III. He was ambitious, yes, but also fragile, prone to depression, and obsessed with theatricality in ways that didn't always resonate with reality. He enjoyed poetry, costume design, and staging operas in his own palace. Not dangerous, not particularly dramatic, just a man quietly performing in a gilded box for himself, which, if you think about it, is rather soothing imagery. Back to the minor German principalities, which are endless fertile ground for sleepy history. The Dukes of Mecklenburg, Anhalt, and Saxe-Coburg spent long days maintaining their tiny courts, supervising embroidery projects, and quietly fretting about succession. Their biggest crises often involved misplaced silverware, slightly crooked portraits, or whether their pet dogs were receiving the proper aristocratic attention. Imagine lying in bed and visualizing endless corridors with velvet carpets, whispering servants, and distant echoes of polite coughs. Gentle, isn't it? Then there's the bizarre but softly amusing story of Prince Eugene of Savoy. He was an exceptional military commander, but his personal quirks are worth noting. He loved books, quiet conversation, and he slept very little, but only because he found the softest couches and read until his eyes drooped. Sometimes he would doze mid-meeting, which apparently annoyed other generals. But to us, imagining a brilliant man softly nodding off over dusty tomes is oddly calming. Meanwhile, minor princesses of Europe, often confined to convents or small palaces, led lives of endless monotony. They embroidered, practiced music, wrote letters, and occasionally fainted from boredom or delicate constitutions. Think of Maria Anna of Bavaria, Maria Josepha of Saxony, or countless noble women whose diaries consist of lists of linen.
Part 3. Sickly princes, spoiled children, and the slow march of royal weirdness. Welcome back. If you're still nestled somewhere cozy, that's perfect. Let's continue our gentle exploration of the slightly tragic, oddly melancholic, and thoroughly underwhelming lives of Europe's royals. No grand battles tonight, no fiery political intrigue, just long corridors, quiet sighs, fainting couches, and the slow, inevitable ticking of time. Let's start with royal children. Ah yes, the tiny heirs who were expected to carry dynasties forward, but were mostly just fragile. Consider the children of Charles II of Spain. His relatives hoped they would grow up strong, healthy, and ideally unremarkable enough to avoid scandal. Instead, most were small, sickly, or strangely disproportionate, which is exactly what happens when generations of cousins marry each other. In a palace filled with gilded furniture and echoing footsteps, these children spent a lot of time lying down, staring at ceilings, or receiving polite scoldings for being ill again. Maria Theresa's offspring, 16 in total, were similarly delicate. Some survived to adulthood, some didn't, and many had quirks that were quietly inconvenient. One daughter, Maria Antonia, liked long hours of embroidery and soft music. Another, Maria Carolina, spent her time worrying about etiquette, succession, and whether her hair was arranged correctly. They were children in title, but functionally, much of their lives was ceremony, expectation, and a steady diet of cautious politeness. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Stuarts produced a number of princes and princesses who were similarly underwhelmingly ill. James II's children had varying degrees of fragility, and the young ones often spent hours in quiet reflection, being fussed over by attendants or secretly hoping for a nap. Life in these palaces wasn't exciting. It was a series of long corridors, slightly too formal meals, and endless polite instruction on how to behave. It's the perfect mental image for those of you slowly drifting off. And then there's the curious case of Frederick the Great as a child. Frederick II of Prussia, before becoming one of the more famous European rulers, was a small, sensitive boy prone to melancholy. His father, Frederick William I, known as the Soldier King, was not particularly interested in gentle parenting. He liked discipline, drills, and yelling in corridors. Frederick II preferred music, poetry, and quietly plotting small rebellions against bedtime and decorum. In retrospect, this makes him relatable. An introverted child surrounded by endless expectations, daydreaming quietly about something softer, calmer, more poetic. Let's drift toward France, shall we? The Dauphin Louis, son of Louis XV, was sickly and melancholy. He suffered from frequent illnesses, lacked energy, and showed little interest in politics. His life was mostly a gentle routine of attending lessons, receiving polite reprimands for poor posture, and faintly worrying about what the court expected of him. Not dramatic, not exciting, but quietly tragic in that very specific, sleepy way. Spanish royal children also deserve a moment of attention. Philip V's offspring, raised in strict etiquette and polite isolation, often developed delicate constitutions and quiet anxieties. Long afternoons were spent in careful instruction: sit like this, eat like that, walk like this. And if one of them sneezed, the court doctor might hover, whispering about potential fevers. Imagine that. Every sneeze observed, every sigh catalogued. Gentle, quiet, and almost hypnotically tedious. Now let's consider the minor German principalities. Royal children there often grew up surrounded by silent corridors, small gardens, and a slow rhythm of learning etiquette, music, and embroidery. They were generally well-fed, but fragile, often prone to fainting from boredom or delicate constitutions. It's a life devoid of adventure, but full of small, repetitive tasks, the ideal backdrop for sleepy contemplation. And speaking of repetition, we must visit the curious, slightly tragic case of the Austrian archdukes. Many were delicate, sickly, and prone to fainting, but they were also stubbornly devoted to their studies, music, and ritualized daily routines. Imagine a young prince sitting quietly, listening to a harpsichord, occasionally coughing politely, and noting the precise alignment of his books. No drama, no sword fights, just gentle, monotonous dedication to a quiet, repetitive existence. Meanwhile, minor princesses often found their solace in embroidery, religious devotion, and polite observation of court life. They were rarely ill in dramatic ways, but were mostly fragile, sensitive, and prone to quiet brooding. The lives of these young women were filled with soft music, long walks in walled gardens, and endless etiquette lessons. Gentle, slow-moving, and oddly hypnotic, perfect for bedtime. Let's float over to Russia briefly. The Romanov children often grew up surrounded by ritual, strict supervision, and gentle melancholy. Tsar Peter III's son, Paul I, had a childhood filled with ceremonial observation and quiet anxiety. He wasn't dramatic or wild. He was polite, studious, and frequently bored. These children often spent hours quietly reading, composing small sketches, or writing letters in careful, meticulous handwriting. Small, repetitive actions filled the long hours of childhood, each one contributing to a calm, almost hypnotic rhythm. Across Scandinavia, minor Danish princes and princesses also led similar lives, quiet, meticulously scheduled, and carefully observed. Christian VII's children grew up under cautious supervision, with tutors, gentle meals, and long stretches of polite inactivity. They were fragile, often melancholy, and sometimes obsessed with minor details, like how the curtains matched the carpet or whether the silverware was aligned correctly. Not exciting, but rhythmically soothing. Returning to France, let's consider the younger children of Louis XV. Several were ill, delicate, and prone to long periods of inactivity. They spent hours quietly observing court life, learning music, and practicing polite smiles. Occasional fainting spells were met with gentle concern rather than drama. Imagine the slow echo of silk against marble floors, the polite whisper of attendants, and the faint sound of a harp in the distance. That's the world of these children. Calm, gentle, slightly melancholy. Meanwhile, the children of the Habsburgs continued the family tradition of quiet fragility. Many were small, prone to illness, and often spent long hours in reflection. Their lives were dictated by protocol, gentle instruction, and the slow rhythm of palace life. No sudden adventures, no dramatic feuds, just endless, soft routines. Gentle breathing in gilded halls. That's the key to this particular form of sleepy history. Let's briefly examine the curious habits of slightly neurotic royals. Charles II.
Part 4. Eccentric adults, quirky habits, and gentle dynastic oddities. Welcome back, friends. If you're still cozily nestled, that's perfect. We're going to continue our slow drift through the quietly tragic, slightly neurotic, and endlessly repetitive world of European royals. No battles, no high-stakes intrigue, just soft corridors, polite sighs, fainting couches, and the gentle rhythm of minor obsessions. Let's start with adult royals who perfected the art of eccentricity without any real danger. Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, provides a calm study in obsessive routine. Later in life, he became deeply fixated on ceremonial perfection and minutiae. He would spend hours inspecting palace halls, making sure tapestries were perfectly aligned and that every chair was just so. Some might call it compulsive, others quiet dedication to symmetry. It's a kind of hypnotic monotony, gently calming if you picture it in your mind. Long hallways, quiet footsteps, faint echo, and the soft brush of a hand smoothing a tapestry. Meanwhile, across France, Louis XV developed a peculiar habit of dozing during state affairs. Not dramatic fainting, not public meltdowns, just quiet, polite naps in the middle of meetings. Attendants learned to tiptoe around him, shifting papers softly, adjusting the temperature and whispering quietly to avoid waking him. Imagine a room full of nobles speaking in hushed tones while the king rests. Not exciting, but soothing. The rhythm of gentle, predictable care is almost hypnotic. Over in Spain, Philip V had a similar attachment to routine and quiet reflection. He enjoyed long walks, studying texts, and quietly pondering succession without much fanfare. Sometimes he would sit alone in gardens, quietly observing the movement of clouds or the tilt of the sun. He was not dramatic or ambitious, mostly content to follow the slow rhythm of court life, soft, repetitive, and ideal for lulling a listener toward sleep. Let's drift northward to Russia. Catherine the Great, though politically ambitious, also maintained private habits that were unexpectedly mundane. She liked to quietly review her library, pen letters, and sometimes stroll alone, observing gardens or palace interiors. While she oversaw the empire with firm hands, the quieter moments reveal someone deeply attuned to routine, detail, and the soft rhythms of palace life. Not thrilling, very, very soothing. And then we have Frederick the Great of Prussia. He was famous for military genius, yes, but his personal quirks were oddly calm. He often walked alone, meditated on literature, and spent long hours at his desk writing letters and poetry. Some might expect a famous general to be restless or dramatic, but Frederick preferred quiet contemplation, music, and meticulous planning. Gentle, repetitive, and almost hypnotically monotonous, perfect for bedtime. Meanwhile, minor German princes perfected quiet eccentricity. They were meticulous about schedules, furniture alignment, and the timing of meals. They often spent hours observing the way light fell across palace floors or carefully counting steps in corridors. Not dramatic, not intense, just slow, deliberate observation. Imagine walking beside one of these princes, matching his pace, counting steps softly, and listening to faint echoes in long hallways, almost soporific. Princesses, too, cultivated subtle but persistent habits, long embroidery sessions, careful observation of minor protocol, and hours writing letters or music. Many had small anxieties about court etiquette, the alignment of tableware, or whether curtains perfectly matched carpets. These are not crises. These are gentle, repetitive routines that create a rhythm, a sense of slow and steady life unfolding. Let's talk briefly about some particularly delicate monarchs. George III of England, for instance, experienced long stretches of quiet introspection, punctuated by mild anxiety. He loved his family, gardens, and simple routines. He walked slowly, spent time with animals, and occasionally obsessively checked that his household was in order. No sudden drama, no duels at midnight, just long, quiet stretches of domestic attention and gentle worry. Perfectly hypnotic if you picture it in your mind. Across Scandinavia, Gustav III of Sweden was another quietly meticulous adult.
Part 5. Quiet Endings, Gentle Oddities, and the Slow Drift of Dynasties. Welcome back, friends. If you're still cozy and the lights are dimmed just right, perfect. We are now gently floating toward the conclusion of our long, sleepy journey through the subtly tragic, slightly neurotic, and endlessly repetitive world of European royals. No battles, no revolutions, just soft hallways, polite sighs, fainting couches, and the hypnotic rhythm of delicate obsessions. Let's start with the later Habsburgs, a family that perfected quiet eccentricity over centuries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Habsburgs had a well-established tradition of fragile health, slight anxieties, and meticulous habits. Francis I of Austria, for example, ruled quietly alongside his wife Maria Theresa, observing palace routines, carefully arranging schedules, and tending to the health and etiquette of his numerous children. Not dramatic, not thrilling, just slow, deliberate, and hypnotically repetitive. Imagine a long hall echoing with soft footsteps, warm sunlight filtering through windows, and an emperor quietly reviewing his daily schedule. Gentle. Meanwhile, Marie-Louise of Austria, who later married Napoleon, also exemplified gentle melancholy. She enjoyed quiet walks, embroidery, and long hours reading in dimly lit rooms. Her life was largely shaped by protocol, personal reflection, and carefully supervised interactions. Minor frustrations, misaligned curtains, a misplaced teacup were handled with gentle sighs and polite adjustments. Not exciting, not dangerous, perfectly suited for bedtime. In France, the late Bourbons continued their own traditions of quiet eccentricity. Louis XVIII spent long stretches in reflection after the tumult of revolution and exile. He quietly inspected palace rooms, adjusted carpets, and ensured every chair was perfectly aligned. His focus on repetitive minor tasks was calming, hypnotic even. Small gestures of order in a world recently touched by chaos. It's almost soothing to picture him moving slowly through soft light, attending to minor details, each action deliberate, quiet, and rhythmic. Meanwhile, Charles X, Louis XVIII's brother, maintained gentle obsessions with etiquette, ceremonial precision, and minor domestic management. His life was largely uneventful, soft, predictable, and repetitive. He often spent time observing palace gardens, reviewing books, or quietly noting the alignment of tapestries. Imagine a slow walk down a long corridor, soft sunlight, echoing footsteps, the faint rustle of silk, and nothing to disturb the gentle rhythm of life. Let's float northward to England. George IV, sometimes called the Prince Regent, spent large portions of his life absorbed in small personal pleasures, arranging furniture, attending private music sessions, and quietly supervising minor domestic tasks. He had his share of health issues and minor anxieties, and he spent long hours quietly observing palace life. Not dramatic, not scandalous, just slow, steady, and hypnotic. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria, despite her long reign and global empire, also had her own quiet eccentricities. She was meticulous about routine, ritual, and daily schedules. Long walks, quiet reading, and careful attention to her household occupied much of her day. Minor annoyances, misaligned curtains, a misplaced teacup were handled with soft sighs and polite adjustments. Across Russia, the later Romanovs continued the tradition of soft eccentricity. Alexander III, Nicholas II, and other family members were largely gentle, reflective, and meticulously attentive to household routines. They supervised minor palace adjustments, observed the daily activities of children and attendants, and quietly managed domestic life. Their lives, while historically significant, were filled with subtle anxieties, patterned routines, and gentle, repetitive motions that make for soothing storytelling. Meanwhile, in minor German states, adult royals perfected subtle obsessions, counting steps, aligning furniture, observing light, and ensuring every minor detail of palace life met their standards. No sudden crises, no duels or rebellions, just soft, repetitive, deliberate action. Imagine walking alongside one of these princes, matching his pace, listening to faint footsteps echoing across long corridors, soft sunlight reflecting off polished floors, gentle, hypnotic, slow. Princesses of these same regions cultivated similar patterns, long hours spent embroidering, quietly observing minor etiquette, reading and writing letters, occasionally fainting from delicate constitutions or soft surprise, attended by whispering servants. Life was slow, predictable, and repetitive, and strangely comforting to imagine. The rhythm of soft activities, gentle observation, and minor anxieties creates a perfect, almost soporific mental soundtrack. Even the more prominent monarchs carried their gentle neuroses. Napoleon's mother, Letizia Bonaparte, carefully supervised her household, counted minor objects repeatedly, and quietly observed daily routines. She was not dramatic, she was diligent, precise, and subtly anxious. Each small action contributed to a long, continuous rhythm of calm repetition. Meanwhile, minor Austrian archdukes observed palace life with meticulous attention. Hours spent quietly walking corridors, noting alignment of objects, observing sunlight, and supervising minor domestic tasks. Gentle, slow, and repetitive. Imagine soft echoes, polished floors, faint distant conversation, and the calm rhythm of centuries of aristocratic life unfolding in soft monotone. And now, let's gently drift toward the subtle emotional patterns of later dynasties. Minor royals often exhibited quiet anxieties, delicate constitutions, and soft eccentricities. Some were neurotic about furniture alignment, others obsessed over minor social etiquette. Still others quietly practiced music or embroidery for hours. Soft sighs punctuated these gentle routines, creating a continuous, hypnotic rhythm that stretches across centuries. Imagine the echoing corridors, sunlight filtering through windows, faint harpsichord music, gentle whisperings, and the faint rustle of silk. Perfect soporific. Even the more prominent monarchs carried their gentle neuroses. Napoleon's mother, Letizia Bonaparte, carefully supervised her household, counted minor objects repeatedly, and quietly observed daily routines. She was not dramatic, she was diligent, precise, and subtly anxious. Each small action contributed to a long, continuous rhythm of calm repetition. Meanwhile, minor Austrian archdukes observed palace life with meticulous attention. Hours spent quietly walking corridors, noting alignment of objects, observing sunlight, and supervising minor domestic tasks. Gentle, slow, and repetitive. Imagine soft echoes, polished floors, faint distant conversation, and the calm rhythm of centuries of aristocratic life unfolding in soft monotone. And so, as we gently close this long journey, imagine all these minor and major royals, Charles II chewing soft bread, Louis XV dozing in Versailles, Frederick the Great strolling quietly, minor German princes counting steps, princesses embroidering, and attendants whispering soft instructions. Each life, however historically significant, unfolds slowly, predictably, and quietly, creating a continuous lullaby of human experience. Soft sunlight across gilded floors, faint harpsichord music in distant corridors, gentle footsteps, polite sighs, meticulous arrangements of objects, repetitive routines, quiet anxieties, slightly melancholic reflections, small fainting spells, and gentle repetitive patterns stretching across centuries. That is the hypnotic, soothing rhythm of royal life, perfect for slowly drifting toward sleep. And now, as we let our imagination float along the echoing corridors, we can picture the countless generations of royals quietly living, observing, repeating. Their lives are not exciting, not dramatic, and not dangerous. They are soft, fragile, and meticulously patterned. And in their quiet repetition, in their gentle melancholy, lies a